welcome to Crary's podcast number 3. Today we have with us Rob Evans. Rob's going to be exhibiting at the Crary Art Gallery from Sunday, May 8th through June 5th. Welcome, Rob.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Oh, good. When did you know that you were an artist?
Well, my parents tell me anyway that I was drawing back before I can even remember. And I knew kind of growing up through school, I was the class artist, the one who always drew things and got attention for drawing things and, would do the mural on the wall, things like that. So I think it's always been a part of my persona growing up. And probably, though, thinking about when I became serious about it, would have been in high school. And I was lucky to have a teacher at my high school who was a professional artist. And he was one of these kind of guys who would fail everybody except those that were really serious about it. So I passed and was able to take a lot of courses at the Smithsonian and other places and really got serious about it at that point.
Excellent. Yeah, because you're looking at your resume, and you have quite the lengthy resume. You've done it, fortunately, it appears all of your life.
That's right, yeah. I went to art school at Syracuse University at their College of Visual and Performing Arts, so I knew when I went to college that I was going to be in the arts in some form. I actually began as an illustration major, thinking that I really wanted to learn how to draw, and back in the 70s and early 80s, in many of the art departments, a lot of the professors in the painting departments hadn't had a rigorous classical drawing sort of background. And many of them were coming out of the abstract expressionist movement. And so I found that the teachers that had the best experience in drawing were in the illustration department. So I began there, but eventually ended up as a painting major and knew once I graduated from college that I was going to be a painter.
Yeah, and looking at your style, you certainly have, from what I can see, the style of your own. How would you describe your style? Well,
I guess it's a contemporary realism or representational. It's a realism, but with a little bit of an edge to it, sort of a dreamlike quality. I guess I could be. I was included in a show at the Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art called Magic Realism, and that's a movement that goes back to the kind of the early, like 1920s, somewhere around that time. And it was that movement was sort of it featured artists who did this dreamlike realism with a little bit of a magical edge to it. And so, I'd say that's probably the closest thing that or movement that my work lines up with.
What inspires your work? Is it events, people, nature?
Really, I'm inspired by everything around me that I connect to in my life. My family, the property where we live, the natural realm, all of those things. I'm interested in ordinary objects, places, people that I know, things that I have sort of a deep connection to, but then looking for a way to transform them into something more universal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I notice as we go through your images, going back from the early days up through today, it seems that you're telling a story in many of your paintings.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a narrative context to it. In a way, I kind of hope that they're a bit ambiguous at the same time, so that it's not hitting you over the head with a specific story or message, but it more kind of opens the door to the viewer and lets you bring your own story or concept to it. But for the most part, most of the works do kind of engage you right away with some kind of a narrative or very overt subject matter.
Mm-hmm. Could you describe the process you go through if you're developing a new piece, going from concept to conclusion? How does that work for you?
Sure. Many of the works begin often with a small sketch, like a little pencil notation or something. It'll be an idea that I have sometimes I'm in the middle of mowing or something. It's just this idea will come to me, or maybe I'll see something around me in my daily life that kind of sparks an idea. And then that little sketch or drawing will sometimes germinate for a long period of time. I'll keep it around in my studio. Every now and then I'll come back to it and look at it and think about it. And then if it's really strong enough that it keeps my attention over a long enough period of time, it'll become an idea that I actually begin to explore further. And I'll either continue to do larger drawings or studies around it. And recently I've been working a lot with Photoshop, where I'll scan a drawing and then play around with it in Photoshop, print it out, paint over the printout, scan that again, go back into Photoshop. So, I love Photoshop as a tool for developing a composition. And it allows you to move things around without having to redraw it over and over again. And so the digital technology now comes into that whole process as well. And then eventually, I think once I've worked an idea up to where I'm ready to go to the final painting, then it becomes a sort of a really focused work, and it'll be in my studio sometimes for, depending on the size, it could be in my studio for a year before it's finished. Some works, and that would be typical of the studio work. And I also do plein air work, which kind of feeds the studio work. And by plein air, I mean working out on location outside. And I do a fair amount of that now, too. I go out and paint along the Susquehanna River here, or in the woods, or around our property. And that's really building up a kind of a vocabulary of effects in nature, things that you can only really get by observing, and then those things I then will bring back to the studio, and they become often parts of studio paintings.
Sure.
So it's a back and forth process.
And the follow-up in terms of that year-long process, I mean, how do you know you're complete with the work after spending much time on it?
That's a good question, and that's the hardest thing to answer. A large painting I did, which is at the permanent collection of the James Michener Art Museum, called Cicada. It's actually the biggest painting I ever did. That painting was in my studio for almost 3 years. I would work on it off and on, and it was included in a show that traveled around the state called Artists of the Commonwealth. It went to the Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art. And when they came to pick up the painting for that traveling exhibit, I was still working on it literally as the truck pulled up. I think sometimes a painting, you almost just have to let it go, even though you may never finish it. I know there's some paintings that are in museums I could go back and work on the wall, if I really wanted to. But
keep a paintbrush out of your hand while you're in the museum.
That's right. They'd arrest me, I think. And so I think you just reach a saturation point with a painting where you just, it may not be done in your mind, but it's done. You're done with it physically. You just have to let go of it.
Sure.
And sometimes, when I look back on paintings and I think, boy, I'm glad I didn't go any further, because I like some of the unfinished quality of certain parts of the painting. I think it's possible to overwork a painting, to the point where it can die on you. So it's really hard to find that exact moment when to let go and just let it stop.
Where would you like to see your work evolve from here? Well,
I think some of the altar pieces that I'm working on right now, and I'll have one in the exhibit at the Crary. There's a study for one called Movement, which I'll talk about a little later. But these works are very large scale and kind of deal with three separate images that are put into an altarpiece format. And I really like the idea of juxtaposing three different images together and having that form some kind of a narrative. And I love it in that format, sort of the old-fashioned format of an altarpiece, which kind of gives it a very different resonance than if it were just sort of paintings hanging on the wall. So that's one direction I'm going. And then I'm also, early in my career, I did a series of interiors, many of which are in the Crary show. I'm interested in kind of going back and doing some more of those. We're in the process of renovating our house, and we're adding a new addition on it, and it's gotten me thinking about our house again and the rooms and the shapes of the spaces in there, and got me intrigued about going back to that.
What would you like for your audience to take away from viewing your work?
Well, I guess I would just hope that it gets them to look at the world in a little bit of a different lens, perhaps seeing it in the way that I've seen some things, and hopefully that will influence them and noticing things that they might not have noticed before around them. I guess that's the best we can hope for, as an artist.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. So, do you do anything recreationally that complements your work?
Well, we do kayaking on the river here, which certainly has an impact on it.
Sure.
And I love to travel, and even though when I'm traveling, I don't usually take my paints with me. It gives you a different perspective on where you are, where you live, by going to see someplace else. And so I always find when I come back from traveling that it gives me a different perspective on my own little world here.
Sure. You mentioned about the altarpiece. You're going to make some comments about specifically the movement, that particular piece. And I just want to let the listeners know that the Crary we're going to have utilizing a little smartphone technology, and we'll be having Rob's comments for a number of pieces posted at the Crary, and they just simply scan the smart tag for the phone from their smartphones, and they'll be able to listen to them through the discussions. So they'll be followed up if you come to the Crary. So just want to give everybody a heads up. Well, Rob, I appreciate you taking the time to discuss your work and your upcoming exhibit. We appreciate having you.
My pleasure.